Today, we're returning to our text on our regular course of study in the book of Acts. We've been studying the book of Acts for 6 years now, and we've made it our way to chapter 8 of that book, which is a rate of approximately 37 weeks per chapter. And if that rate holds steady, then we've got another 739 weeks to go before we finish the book of Acts. So at this pace, if this trend continues, I predict we'll wrap up this series on Sunday, March 14, 2038, just in time for Easter of that year. But today, what I want to do is to begin to read through Acts 9, 1 through 31, the passage describing the conversion of Saul, and make commentary along the way. Now, we won't get very far. We'll only get a couple of verses in, but this is the path I want to head down this morning. Acts 9, starting in verse 1. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. And here I think it's important to stress the degree to which Paul, at this point in his life, hated Christianity, Christians, and Christ. This was not a momentary lapse of reason. This was Paul's conscious, decided, thoroughly ingrained, and habituated stance. Some of you may recall that 23 or so weeks ago, in lesson number 275 of this series, Veiled Language, we took a hard look at Gamaliel's speech to the Sanhedrin in Acts 5. But we looked at his speech in the context of the sideways speech that Middle Eastern men tend to use whenever they don't want their meaning to be plain, but they want it to be understood. In Western societies, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and the Netherlands, people tend to speak very directly, saying exactly what they mean. But in Eastern societies, such as Russia, China, India, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, people tend to speak much more indirectly, speaking in euphemisms, figures of speech, idioms, and sometimes just flat out saying the opposite of what they actually mean. Cultures where direct speech is used are often referred to as low context cultures. Cultures where people speak more indirectly are often referred to as high context cultures. Quoting from a paper by R.S. Zaharna, a professor of cultural studies at American University, the difference between high and low context cultures depends on how much meaning is found in the context versus the code, that is, the actual words spoken. Low context cultures, such as the American culture, tend to place more meaning on the language code, the actual words, and very little meaning in the context, what can be deduced by what's left unsaid. For this reason, communication among Americans tends to be specific, explicit, and analytical. Whereas in high context cultures like the Middle East, meaning is embedded more in the context, what is left unsaid, rather than the code, what's actually said. Thus, the listener must understand certain contextual cues in order to grasp the full meaning of the message. People raised in high context systems expect more from others than do the participants in low context systems. When talking about something that they have on their minds, a high context individual will expect the people he's talking to know what's bothering him, so that he doesn't have to be specific. The result is that he will talk around the point, in effect, putting all the pieces in place except the crucial one. In other words, in high context exchanges, much of the burden of meaning appears to fall on the listener. In low context cultures, such as ours, the burden appears to fall on the speaker to accurately and thoroughly convey the meaning in his or her spoken or written message. As author Sarah Lanier said in an interview, the way people speak in Middle Eastern culture, on the other hand, is much more indirect. It's all about friendliness and politeness. If offered a cup of coffee, I say, "No, thank you." The host offers it again, and I decline again with something like, "No, don't bother yourself." He might offer a third time, and I'd reply, "No, really, I don't want any coffee. Believe me." Then my host will serve me coffee, and I will drink it. When asked, "But what if you really don't want coffee?" Lanier explained that such a conversation would take several minutes and would involve many words of praise, gratitude, respect, and polite but false promises of future coffees together. And the reason why this is important for us to understand is because everything in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, happens against the backdrop of a high context culture in which indirect speech is very often used in preference to direct speech. That's what's so remarkable about the way that Jesus speaks, about the way that the apostles speak. It's very different from their peers in their culture. In my previous lesson, I gave you 3 examples from the Old Testament in which indirect speech is used in preference to direct speech. Lamech's saying in Genesis 4, which is actually a veiled threat of domestic violence. Abraham's refusal of spoils in Genesis 14, which is actually a direct and biting insult to the kings of the plains, whom he rescued in the War of the 9 Kings. And Abraham's negotiations with the sons of Het over the purchase of the field at Machpelah in Genesis 23, in which, by Western standards, no sale was ever made, but according to Middle Eastern standards, a legal sale occurred. Now, with that lens in mind, consider the words of Gamaliel in Acts 5, 33 through 39. When they heard this, they were enraged and wanted to kill them. But a Pharisee in the council named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law held in honor by all the people, stood up and gave orders to put the men outside for a little while. And he said to them, "Men of Israel, take care what you're about to do with these men. For some time ago, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. He was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census and drew away some of the people after him. He too perished, and all who followed him were scattered. So in the present case, I tell you, keep away from these men and let them alone. For if this plan or this undertaking is of man, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might even find yourself at odds with God." Now, as Westerners who live in a direct language culture and who engage habitually in low context speech, we make certain assumptions about Gamaliel and his speech. Gamaliel comes highly recommended, and so we tend to take what he says at face value. And what he says looks like godly advice on the surface. But if you just put your fingernail up under his words and pull back a couple of layers of misdirection, it looks a little different. At least it does to me. You see, there's a good psychological rule of thumb that I learned many years ago that has helped me to separate truth from falsehood in lots of situations. And the rule is this: if someone says something and you're unsure of their motive, look at the outcome of their words and then infer the motive by examining the results. Jesus was a rabbi who, in keeping with his tradition, started teaching when he turned 30. And the 12 apostles, most of whom were teenagers, except for Peter, who was in his 20s, were his students. And they followed him like a sensei, living with him full time, and they hung on his every word, for he was the way and the truth and the life. Well, Gamaliel was also a rabbi. Now, he was older than Jesus, and he had graduated several classes of young students, but make no mistake about it, his students were also teenage boys, and they followed him just as closely as the 12 followed Jesus. And the students of Gamaliel hung on his every word, as though he were the way, the truth, and the life. But Gamaliel isn't an advocate of direct speech. His words are jaded. He's a Middle Eastern man in a Middle Eastern culture, and he's a scholar and master rhetorician, and he has the art of speaking in veiled language down to a science. And in his speech to the Sanhedrin, he says something that, to me, is highly suspicious. And he doesn't want the apostles to hear it, so he puts them out of the room when he says it. Now, I don't want to make light of this matter, but just for the sake of cultural clarity, I want you to imagine the following words coming out of the mouth of a studied, practiced, and artful double speaker. So don't imagine this being said in the voice of Jimmy Stewart or Henry Fonda or Tom Hanks. Rather, imagine these words coming out of the mouth of Joe Pesci or Robert De Niro or James Gandolfini. Because what Gamaliel says is, remember that guy, Theudas? He started talking a big game. He wound up dead. And the Sanhedrin didn't have to lift a finger. Some people in a lynch mob took care of it. And then remember that other guy, Judas the Galilean? He started making some noise, and he wound up dead. No one here had to say a word. Somebody else took care of it. So what about these guys? Don't sweat it. If they keep talking smack, something will happen to them. Forget about it. God will take care of it. Now, that may sound conspiratorial. And the reason for that is because it is. Remember, if someone says something and you're unsure of their motive, look at the outcome of their words, and then infer the motive by examining the results. Gamaliel told the Sanhedrin, hey, don't worry about these guys. If they get out of hand, something will happen to them. It'll get taken care of. And that satisfied the members of the High Council, who just 5 minutes earlier wanted to kill the apostles. And now they're content to leave their fate up to the tendency of agitators to wind up dead. But that isn't all that happened. Because you turn the page, and in chapter 6 of the book of Acts, we find Stephen, a man full of grace, a faithful Christian, a teacher of the word, and a deacon of the church, being seized by a mob of politically connected militia types. Turn to chapter 7, and within an hour, this mob had stoned Stephen to death. And at the end of chapter 7, who do we find? Standing in the midst of that mob, holding the coats of the men who stoned Stephen, but keeping his own hands clean. But Gamaliel's star pupil, his brightest and best protege, none other than Saul of Tarsus. As Paul himself said to the mob that had put him on trial in Acts 22, 3-5, I'm a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel, who was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors, and I was a zealot for God, just as all of you here are today. I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison, as the high priest and all the council can testify themselves. I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus, and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. Beloved, when we encounter Paul in Acts 9, he is not an innocent but misguided man who got a little carried away with his zeal for the Lord and went a little overboard. He's an operative working for the enforcement division of the Sanhedrin, which is a criminal organization as corrupt as the government of any third world country in the world. A cartel funded by the temple treasury, which acts under a cloak of righteousness as wolves in sheep's clothing to advance their own interests and the interest of other government conspirators. They are whitewashed tombs full of dead men's bones and rotting flesh. That's the organization of which Gamaliel is a prominent member. Gamaliel was there when the Sanhedrin decided that it was their policy that Lazarus must die. Gamaliel was there when the Sanhedrin voted by unanimous consent that Jesus must die for the sake of the nation. It was business as usual for the Sanhedrin when Annas and Caiaphas met with Judas, paid him 30 pieces of silver, and arranged for Jesus to be arrested under the cloak of darkness, to be spirited away by night and put on trial after hours in an off-the-books trial at the home of the high priest. And it was business as usual for the Sanhedrin when Judas, filled with grief, came to the high priest and, treating them as his priests, confessed his sin to them and asked them to give him a sacerdotal remedy, a just verdict for his tortured soul. And they abdicated their offices, shirked their responsibility as priests, and knowing that the penalty under the law for betraying innocent blood was death, instructed Judas to administer justice to himself. Because as God's representatives to the people of Israel on earth, the high priest unambiguously told Judas to kill himself. Those were Gamaliel's bedfellows. That's how the Sanhedrin rolled. And Gamaliel was a captain in that cartel, which organization was every bit as corrupt as the Vatican in its worst days ever thought about being. And he had field operatives who carried out his orders, doing his bidding and the bidding of the Sanhedrin throughout the precincts of Judea. And his chief operative in the final solution to rid Judea of the heretical vermin who followed Christ and worshiped Jesus of Nazareth as their Lord and Savior was Paul, Saul of Tarsus. And when we encounter Paul in Acts 9, he had been at it, making the world a better place by ridding it of people like you and me since Acts 5, which is a period of about 3 years. Because of Peter and John and Gamaliel's speech to the Sanhedrin took place in about 3 AD, but Paul's encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus took place in about 36 AD. Now, we don't know how many people Paul had arrested and sent to their deaths prior to Acts 9, but the consensus among Bible scholars is that at the very least, Paul was responsible for the deaths of several dozen people, but it could very well have been as many as a few hundred. But considering his own testimony in Galatians 1:13, for you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and laid waste to it. I'm inclined to think that the number was not in the dozens, but in the hundreds, which would make him every bit as prolific as a state-sponsored agent of death as any member of the NKVD in the Soviet Union or the MSS in Communist China. So it would seem that Paul was not exaggerating when in 1 Timothy 1:15 he referred to himself as the chiefest of sinners. This was not an humble brag. The humility. Paul genuinely considered his sins against the church to be appreciably greater or discernibly more grave, more serious, more grievous than the sins of others. That was his opinion of himself. And here I just want to stop and make a side note. Because in the church, in many places in the church, we have been told that there are no degrees of sin, that all sins are equal, and no one sin is any greater than any other. And that teaching is based on Matthew 5:21 through 28, and James 2:8 through 11. But beloved, neither of those passages says that. Not even close. What Jesus says in Matthew 5 is, you think keeping the law makes you righteous? The law says thou shalt not commit murder. And you think because you haven't actually killed anyone that you're righteous? Well, yes, murder is sin, but fostering anger in your heart against your brother is also sin. And when the judgment comes, it isn't just your infractions that will indict you, but you'll be indicted by the intent of your heart as well. The law says thou shalt not commit adultery, and you think that because you haven't actually cheated on your spouse that you're righteous? Yes, adultery is sin, but fostering lust in your heart is also sin. And when the judgment comes, it isn't just your infractions that will indict you, but you'll be indicted by the intent of your heart as well. But nowhere in that discourse does he ever say that there's no difference between your actions and your thoughts. There obviously is a difference between the two, which is why he has to belabor the point in order to show us the similarity between the two. Obviously, evil thoughts aren't as consequential as evil deeds. But, says Jesus, don't imagine for a minute that he who judges the thoughts and intents of the heart will overlook the evil in your heart. You are liable for every evil in your heart, but those that are realized as deeds, both those that are realized as deeds and those that are not realized as deeds. But the fact that the judge will both see and assess the secrets of your heart doesn't mean that when those secrets are weighed on the scales of righteousness, they will be found to be as weighty as your sinful deeds. And the same goes for James 2:8 through 11. In that passage, James tells us that if you break one part of the law, then you've broken the whole law. But that doesn't mean that all sins are the same. This week, I watched a documentary on the Basilica Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, Spain, which has been under construction for 140 years. And according to this documentary, the basilica is supposed to be finished sometime next year, in 2026. And when it's completed, it'll be the grandest cathedral in the whole world. This thing is a marvel of architecture, and I would love to see it with my own eyes sometime in my lifetime. Now, suppose you had a scale model of this basilica, a miniature of the whole thing, perfect in every detail. Every spire, every arch, every window, every column replicated down to the most minute detail, all carved from one single piece of the finest black onyx. And because of its perfect precision, your model, your sculpture might be valued in the millions and millions of dollars. But then something happens to it, and it gets broken. Now, it's barely damaged. Most people looking at it would never even notice, because the damage is limited to one figurine in one tableau in one grotto of one of the spires. But it is broken. Do you think that'll affect the value of the sculpture? Well, of course it will. And you can't just replace that part, even if you were to replace it with workmanship that were as deft and meticulous as the original, because the original is all one piece. And the part that was broken isn't a separate part. No, because that one little part is broken, the whole thing is broken. That's what James is telling us in James 2. The law is one. The law is perfect, and if you break one part of it, you break the whole thing. But that is not the same thing as saying that all violations of the law are equally grievous. That is not the same thing as saying, well, I messed up and committed a tax violation, so I may as well just go ahead and get started on genocide. No, that's absurd. But as stupid as that may sound, I hardly have a month go by when I don't hear some Christian somewhere say something like, well, we've all sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and all sin is sin, and one sin is no greater than any other. And I wonder to myself, how did our moral landscape get so flattened? How did that happen? How did we get to the point that we don't see a qualitative difference between littering and grand larceny? How did we get to the point that a public figure commits multiple crimes against his or her own people, and that figure's critics opine, you know, the worst part about it is the hypocrisy? How did our economy of sin, how did the way that we evaluate sin get so inflated that on a graph, unless you were to supply an artificially elevated non-zero axis, you couldn't even see the gradations between one trespass and another? Is misgendering someone really the moral equivalent of murder? Really? Or have we all gone insane? Because clearly, God distinguishes between one sin and another, and he considers some sins to be more consequential than others. Now, at this point, I'm going to pause for a minute because I'm on something of a tear, and I don't want to derail this lesson. So before I go any further, let me just say that in regard to the fact that in the kingdom of God, there is a whole hierarchy of sin, and clearly God considers some sins to be greater than others, there's a lot to say. And someday I'll preach on that. And when I do, that series of lessons will consist of no fewer than 6 or 8 sermons, because the Bible gives us lots of material to digest on this question. Scores upon scores of passages is unequivocal. There's no question as to whether or not there are degrees of sin. There are. And if there's anyone listening to this lesson who wants biblical proof of that, just email me here at the church and I'll be more than happy to send that to you. But for the sake of today's lesson, let me just offer you one verse to go to should you ever find yourself waffling on the question. Because if there were no degrees of sin, no gradations in degrees of sin guilt, then Jesus could not and would not have said what he said in John 19:11. when after Pilate said to him, "Do you know that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" And Jesus answered him, "You have no authority over me at all except what has been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of the greater sin." Now, why does that matter? Why does any of that matter? What does that have to do with today's lesson and our study of the conversion of Saul on the road to Damascus? Well, the relevance is simply this. In Acts 9, 1 through 2, we are told, meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. And it seems to me that we tend to forget that that short synopsis of the mission that Paul was on when the Lord intercepted him on the road to Damascus comes to us in a much larger context. That Paul, though he had convinced himself that he was on the path of righteousness, had lifelong associations with some very bad people. Because the Sanhedrin wasn't an essentially good organization with a few bad apples. It was a criminal organization, a corrupt, semi-religious and semi-governmental organization that was involved in murder after murder after murder, masquerading as God's representatives on earth. And Paul was a made man in that cartel. And his goal in life was to have a seat on the high council and for Gamaliel and Annas and Caiaphas to be his peers. And in order to achieve that goal, he was willing to send hundreds of innocent Christians, both men and women, to their deaths. He refers to himself as the chiefest of sinners. Now, there may be a degree of self-depreciation in that statement, maybe a degree of hyperbole. I mean, there are plenty of people in history who are responsible for far worse things than Paul ever was. I mean, there were more than 300 tyrants in ancient Greece alone, each of them who was personally responsible for spilling the blood of hundreds or even thousands of innocent people, all predating Paul. He's far from the most wayward zealot who ever lived. He's far from the most bloodthirsty, aspiring politician who ever lived. He's far from the deadliest enemy of the church in the first century. But don't miss the point. Because if you do anything in your heart and mind to minimize or to take away from or to diminish the true nature of the man that Paul was prior to verse 3 of chapter 9 of the book of Acts, you will misapprehend the scope and the breadth and the height and the depth of the conversion of Saul on the road to Damascus. He wasn't converted from here to here. He was converted from here to here. Until you really wrap your arms around what Paul was converted from, you'll never fully appreciate what he was converted to. Now, that's as far as we're going to get in the book of Acts today. Next week, we'll take a closer look at the enormity of the change that took place in Paul when the Lord got a hold of him. For now, let me just leave you with these words. from Isaiah 1:18. Come now, let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins be as scarlet, they will be as white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool. And that is my lesson for today.